Good evening to our viewers in Korea and hello to others watching from around the world. Coming to you live from Seoul, I'm Han Daeun. The UN Security Council has passed a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire and release of hostages in Gaza. The resolution, the first since the Israel-Hamas conflict began 5 months ago, came as the U.S. abstained, further intensifying tensions between the U.S. and Israel. All this while the war in Ukraine rages on, with Russia asserting Ukraine's involvement in the Moscow concert attack that claimed at least 139 lives. For an in-depth analysis of the escalating geopolitical tensions, we now invite Ban Kil-joo, research professor at Ilmin International Relations Institute of Korea University. So great to have you with us.
Good evening. Glad to be here.
We also have VOA Correspondent Chris Casquejo joining us from Washington, D.C. We are delighted to have you back.
Good to be with you.
All right, Professor Pan, let's start with you. The UN Security Council has finally passed a resolution breaking a 5-month impasse. First, tell us about its significance and what the passage means for Gaza.
Well, since the resolution was finally passed, I think that the international society will be able to better deal with the humanitarian crisis in Gaza despite its lack of perfection. Before deep dive into the UN Security Council resolutions of 2728, we need to take a look at what was happening. Why do repetitive vetoes or abstentions continue to go on by the UN Security Council's permanent members, called the P5? Amid the deepening Cold War mechanism, the UN Security Council has come to a standstill. Not only China and Russia, but also the United States exerting its veto power as one of the P5 members in the UN Security Council to seize the diplomatic and strategic initiative in this platform. To put it another way, the UN served as an arena for great power competition, not a platform to resolve international disputes or challenges. At first glance, the UN Security Council's failure to pass the resolution related to Gaza in a timely manner appeared technical. For example, China and Russia were unpleased with the word imperative, which was included in the US proposed draft resolution. China and Russia notified that the use of imperative, not demand or call, was not only an empty wording, but also intended to manipulate international society. However, the real factor was not the use of word choice, but anti-American power in the UN Security Council. What happened was that under the new Cold War dynamics, China and Russia strongly opposed the resolution laid out by the United States. As you're well aware, since the resolutions were swayed by P5 members, 10 non-permanent members, including South Korea, proposed a resolution. At the end of the day, the newly laid out resolution has been passed for the immediate release of hostages and for ensuring humanitarian access to Gaza. All in all, the seeming battle for word choice is not a simple difference of expression, but a strategic competition between great powers. In the meantime, what makes me worried more is that this type of confrontation is expected to be more deepening as time goes by under the logic of the new Cold War.
Well, even so, many say that it was a significant day for the UN Security Council, as it has been undergoing failure after failure to pass a ceasefire resolution, as you've pointed out, due mainly to the widening rift among permanent members, among the P5. But Professor Pan, questions remain about the implementation, as UNSC members disagree on whether the resolution is legally binding. U.S. Ambassador to UN Linda Thomas-Greenfield says it's not, while others, including the Chinese ambassador, argues it is legally enforceable. What are your thoughts on this? Would Israel and Hamas both comply with this?
To be honest, the UN Security Council is supposed to be binding, as you pointed out. However, in reality, a rules-based international order is at stake, as shown by North Korea's continuous provocations against UN Security Council resolutions. In this vein, we need to take a closer look at how this resolution is being implemented. Meanwhile, there is a different viewpoint between Israel and Hamas on this resolution. Israel remains unpleased with the resolution while saying that Hamas would not release hostages. In particular, Israel argues that the UN allowed a ceasefire to be possibly made even without releasing hostages by Hamas. In contrast, Hamas appears pleased while saying that it is willing to exchange between Palestinian prisoners and Israeli hostages. Whether the exchange between prisoners and hostages is made indeed in the first phase is expected to determine how effectively the implementation of this resolution is going to be made. At the same time, the willingness and position of the United States is going to be important because the United States abstained from the resolution of 2728, unlike the other 14 members who agreed with the resolution. Moreover, as you pointed out earlier, the U.S. takes this resolution as a non-binding resolution. So how to implement this resolution indeed remains to be seen.
Well, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres made a strong statement towards both Israel and Hamas, saying that their failure to comply with the resolution would be unforgivable. But even so, according to various reports, Israel is continuing its attacks in the Gaza Strip as we speak, with no sign of letting up. So we'll have to see if the resolution will be powerful enough to bind Israel as well as Hamas. And also, as you highlighted, Professor Ban, we'll also have to keep a close eye on how the U.S. will handle this situation. And now to you, Chris. Washington's decision to abstain on the vote, the sharpest action against its ally yet, prompted Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to cancel a scheduled trip to the U.S. by two of his top advisors. How is the resolution impacting U.S.-Israel relations?
Well, they've gone from chilly to even chillier. A U.S. abstention allowed the ceasefire vote to pass on Monday's vote. 14 other members of the Security Council voted yes, and it allowed it to move forward after a 5-month impasse. White House Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said Washington abstained because the resolution did not explicitly condemn Hamas for the October 7th attack. Now, as you mentioned, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu immediately canceled a visit by a high-level delegation to the U.S. that was to discuss the planned Israeli military operation in the southern city of Rafah, where some 1.5 billion Palestinians have sought shelter. Monday's resolutions had replaced the word permanent with the word lasting to describe the ceasefire under consideration. Now, this resolution also calls for the release of the hostages taken on October 7th, but not as a condition of the ceasefire. There are still more than 100 hostages believed to be being held by Hamas. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, issued a statement saying a ceasefire would have been possible months ago had Hamas been willing to release the hostages, and she called on the UN Security Council to demand that Hamas accept the ceasefire agreement being offered.
Well, it looks like we're really seeing the peak of U.S.-Israel tensions since the war broke out. Tensions have been mounting between the two countries over a number of issues, including the post-war plans for Gaza, as well as the Israel's planned assault on the southern city of Rafah, which we will discuss more details later in our show. But it looks like President Biden and Netanyahu both have no viable alternative way out of this collision. So we'll have to keep close tabs. And staying with you, Chris, tensions have been mounting, as we said, between the U.S. and Israel, as Netanyahu is determined to carry out planned assault on Rafah, even without U.S. backing if necessary. How will the U.S. try to convince Israel to change its Rafah plan now that Israeli officials have canceled their trip to Washington?
Well, during that U.S. visit, the Israeli delegation was supposed to present the White House with its detailed plans to send troops into Rafah. Now, White House spokesperson John Kirby says the president is very disappointed that the delegation is no longer coming. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant met with Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Monday. Secretary of State Blinken reiterated the United States' support for ensuring the defeat of Hamas, including in Rafah, while reiterating opposition to a major ground operation in Rafah that would further jeopardize the welfare of the more than 1.5 million Palestinian civilians who are sheltering there. Secretary of State Blinken also underscored that alternatives exist to a major ground invasion that would both better ensure Israel's security and protect Palestinian civilians. Secretary Blinken also discussed the need to immediately surge and sustain additional humanitarian assistance to meet the needs of civilians in Gaza. So it's clear that the U.S. is trying to walk a fine line here with its relationship with Israel, while also addressing the needs of Palestinian civilians who need that aid to come in desperately.
The U.S. and Israel have a strong and long-standing military alliance, with the U.S. providing significant military aid to Israel. But Netanyahu, many say, is jeopardizing the alliance by confronting Washington over Rafah. Professor Pan, why is Netanyahu so determined to carry out the assault despite the high stakes?
Well, the U.S.-Israeli alliance is indeed at stake. This swaying alliance was never been expected when President Biden was fully supportive of Israel in the event of Hamas attacks on Israel citizens on 7 October last year. If then, what makes allies less cohesive and even more confrontational? To put it another way, why is Prime Minister Netanyahu taking the risk of jeopardizing the alliance while disregarding Washington's concern, as you noted? Well, we need to think about the two dimensions, international and international. On the one hand, when it comes to the international outlook, the United States is declining gradually and its hegemonic power is stopping its function, which led to the weakening of its diplomatic leverage with its ally, Israel. Since the US-led international order is not fully functional, Israel seems to be motivated to decide what it wants in its own way based on its strategic autonomy, while staying away from the alliance-based decision. On the other hand, regarding an intranational factor, Prime Minister Netanyahu tends to regard the Hamas-Israel war not only as an interstate war, but as a domestic political war. Netanyahu is concerned that if he loses this war, he could be punished by the domestic audience, losing the domestic battleground to seize the political power. Furthermore, he loses political power, he could go to prison because he remains persecuted. So Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to take the two measures. The first measure is to overemphasize on outside enemy and make Israel cohesive and solidify internally, which can be defined as the diversionary theory of war. The second option is to defend on the far-right extremists heavily. The extremists are proud of Netanyahu while depicting him as the only leader who can say no to the United States. Likewise, Netanyahu wants to please the extremists and win domestic politics. This international factor clearly shows how Prime Minister Netanyahu deals with this war. In short, the bungling international order led by the weakening American power and individual motivation to continue to its political grip drove the U.S.-Israel alliance to be swayed. So the underlying factor is both political and structural in the two dimensions, international and international.
Well, Netanyahu has repeatedly said that his only goal is total victory over the Hamas militants, and that cannot be achieved without going into Rafah. Now to you, Chris. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant will visit Washington, is actually in Washington as we speak, to hold talks with his U.S. counterpart and other senior U.S. officials. Will the two countries be able to narrow the widening gap?
Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is very aware of the U.S. position on Israel's intended invasion of Rafah. Secretary of State Blinken delivered it in person to the War Cabinet in Israel last week, and again when he met with Israeli Defense Minister Gallant on Monday. Netanyahu maintains that sending troops into Rafah is the only way to eliminate Hamas and its rebels. Gallant has previously said that the Gaza war won't stop until Hamas is defeated. Now, U.S. President Biden has said that Netanyahu is hurting more than helping Israel. So it's very clear that both countries have a wide gulf, but the U.S. is still trying to walk that fine line of maintaining its support for Israel, and also trying to get aid to the civilians in Gaza and Rafah. So, as long as they're talking, it's a good sign. But the fact that Netanyahu canceled this high-level meeting between the leaders is not a good sign. But at least both sides are continuing to engage at high levels, if not the highest levels.
Now, shifting gears to the deadly attack in a concert hall in Moscow that killed at least 139 people. The attack has been claimed by the Islamic State group, and the U.S. says it has no reason to doubt the claim. But Russia argues the gunmen are linked to Ukraine. Professor Pan, what's your analysis of the situation?
Well, I would say that blaming Ukraine for this attack is simply a part of the propaganda or is made under the psychological warfare by Russia. I do believe that there is no possibility that the Moscow concert hall terror attack is linked to Ukraine from the viewpoint of, first, ISIS' long-standing animosity toward Russia, second, war strategy, and third, support from the international society. First of all, Islamic State claimed responsibility for this terror attack. In addition, the United States informed in more detail that this attack was tied to ISIS-K, whose areas of operation is in Central Asia. Moreover, reportedly, this group had already planned to make an attack in Russia since last year. ISIS has a long and strong animosity against Russia, particularly due to its supporting role in the Syrian government on the civil war battlefield. Second, from the viewpoint of war strategy, this type of attack is disadvantageous for Ukraine. Ukraine is conducting a just war against Russia, who is doing unjust war. However, if Ukraine were to be linked to this type of terrorist attack, the just war discourse is most likely to lose momentum. When losing its justification, Ukraine's capacity to fight could weaken because support from both the domestic audience and international groups could be reduced significantly. In this vein, there is no reason that Ukraine would intervene in this attack. Finally, if this attack proved to be linked to Ukraine, Ukraine could be blamed as a rule breaker similar to Russia because it is regarded as a rule-breaking act, particularly regarding differentiation between competents and non-competents during this war. Ukraine's rise to a rule breaker is bad for having more military assets from outside because external actors' support might not be justified by their domestic audiences. The continuous external support matters for Ukraine to continue its fight against a stronger Russia. So there's no reason for Ukraine to take this huge risk, particularly in a situation where its war campaign is in a difficult phase. I would say this terror attack is linked to Ukraine, but rather is made possible due to Russia's failure to monitor the terrorist groups. Why did it fail? One of the reasons why Moscow failed to spot and counter the possible terror attack early is that it neglected its fight against terrorists while dealing with interstate war on the Ukraine battlefield. In short, Moscow failed to prioritize this task. So it is the Russian government, not Ukraine, who should be blamed. To put it differently, the Russian government neglected to protect its citizens from terrorist attacks while engaging in unnecessary war with Ukraine. All in all, I would say that Putin intends to blame Ukraine for rescuing himself from his responsibility for failure and making Russians solidify internally.
And that claim is echoed by various top experts worldwide. And according to the White House, the U.S. warned Russian authorities earlier this month about a terrorist attack possibly targeting large gatherings in Moscow. Does this mean Putin ignored the warning? What have you learned so far about this?
National Security Council spokesperson Adrian Watson said that the White House tried to warn Russians about a possible attack on large gatherings such as concerts earlier this month. Now, this is part of the U.S.'s so-called duty to warn policy that it has with other nations when the U.S. gets intelligence that impacts civilians around the world. Now, as we've said, that Russian President Vladimir Putin called the warning an attempt to intimidate Russians. He suggested as we've said, that there's a connection between the suspects and Kiev, which has not found to be the case so far. But Adrian Watson, the national security spokesperson, says that ICE alone is responsible and no one from Ukraine is involved. That has not stopped Russian state media from pushing the narrative that Ukraine is somehow responsible. Now, Putin said on Monday that the gunmen are radical Islamists, but he repeated his accusation that Ukraine could have played a role despite Kyiv's strong denials. On Sunday, a Moscow court charged 4 of the suspects with the attack. All are from Tajikistan, but they are living in Russia. 7 other people have been detained in connection with the attack.
All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have tonight. Thank you, Chris and Professor Ban, for making time for us and sharing your valuable perspectives.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.